Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming out tonight and braving the traffic and the parking issues. Oh, my goodness. But we're very glad to have you here, and hopefully we're going to have a very entertaining and fun evening together. I'm Heidi. I'm one of your CU Regents at large, and I'm the founder of the Free to Be Coalition, along with Neelam Desai and Madison Meeks, as well as Marcus Fatanos, who's not here tonight as well. And Madison is the leader of our Free to Be Student Club at CU Boulder. So let's give her a hand. She was amazing in putting all of this together. Thank you, Madison. The Free to Be Coalition is an effort by leaders on college campuses here and across the nation to encourage students to challenge their beliefs through the guarantee of free speech and intellectual debate. Our hope is to honor the words of the great President Bruce Benson, our president here previously at CU for 11 years, that we should teach students how to think, not what to think. The Free to Be Coalition launched our campus efforts early last year with the Vicente Fox-Nigel Farage debates here and at UCCS by bringing diverse voices to campus. Free to Be then followed up those debates with a candidate debate in the fall of 2018 and a panel discussion on the opioid crisis last spring. We will continue to bring forth important and timely issues that are relevant to the community in order to promote and demonstrate healthy civil discussion and expose students to different perspectives. These days, you seldom find real debates over important public issues on our college campuses. That is the finding of political science professor George Lanoue in his book, Silent Stages. Lanoue writes, debates can create recognition and a space for dissenting ideas that will enrich classroom discussions, research agendas, and hiring decisions. Policy debates can function like tilling exhausted soil so that new life can grow. Exhausted soil. That's a good description of many college campuses. And as a regent, I can attest we do get exhausted sometimes. But we at Free to Be believe that what is lacking is respectful and intellectual combat. Perhaps some of our students at CU who are utterly certain of their correctness might utter at the end of this debate like this, wait, I never thought about that. That's what we hope for. Our other hope tonight is to open your mind, to model for our students what feisty collaborative debate looks like and how we might re-examine where the intersection of right and wrong exists. 60 years ago, Chief Justice Earl Warren warned our nation that we had a choice. Either teachers and students must always remain free to inquire, to study, and to evaluate, or our civilization will stagnate and die. There was no third option. We're at a turning point in our country's history. The Free to Be Coalition aims to turn us towards respect, to listening to each other, and to finding the best solutions for the biggest problems by hearing from all sides. We ask each of you to model this tonight, respect and openness, and to hear both perspectives and to ask clarifying questions at the end to help you come to the best conclusions. Tonight's discussion will be moderated by Guy Benson, political editor of townhall.com, a regular guest on NPR's All Things Considered, and the host of the nationally syndicated Guy Benson Show, along with Matthew Burgess, assistant professor of environmental studies here at CU Boulder and a member of the Heterodox Academy. Also joining us tonight are Alex Epstein and Robert Kennedy Jr. Sorry, Alex Epstein. Alex, I knew I was going to do that. I'm so sorry. Robert is an agent of change among environmental activists who holds a bold vision for America's future, in which energy independence and sustainable technology revitalize the nation's economy. As president of the board for Waterkeeper Alliance, Kennedy continues to lead the fight against those that pollute the nation's waterways. Robert cemented his reputation as a high-profile activist with the publication of Crimes Against Nature, which called into question the country's environmental policies. He has also been involved with numerous clean tech corporate and venture capital groups. Despite his presentations, it's easy to see why Robert was named one of Rolling Stone magazine's 100 Agents of Change. His expertise is evident and his passion palpable as he outlines the steps we can take to reduce the national debt and increase U.S. economic competitiveness by investing in the development of sustainable technologies. Robert believes it is truly possible to protect the planet and make the world a better place for future generations. Alex Epstein is a philosopher who argues that human flourishing should be the guiding principle of industrial and environmental progress. He founded Center for Industrial Progress in 2011 to offer a positive, pro-human alternative to the green movement. Alex is the author of The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, a New York Times bestseller, arguing that if we look at the whole picture, human flourishing requires that humanity use more fossil fuels, not less. The book has been widely praised as the most persuasive argument ever for our continuing use of fossil fuels, winning Epstein the Most Original Thinker of 2014 award from the McLaughlin Group. Alex is known for his willingness to debate anyone, anytime, and has publicly debated leading environmentalist organizations such as Greenpeace, the Sierra Club, and 350.org over the morality of fossil fuel use. He has made his moral case for fossil fuels at dozens of campuses, including Harvard, Yale, Stanford, and Duke, his alma mater. I'd like now to bring up all of our speakers and our moderator, Guy Benson, to take the stage and kick our discussion off tonight. Thank you.
Good evening. Good to see you all out here. As you just heard, my name is Guy Benson, and I felt like I would just begin by offering a note of transparency. So with my background and what I do for a living, I think it's important for me to say right out of the gate that I am not unbiased. I think it's preferable for people in my line of work, in the media, to disclose where we're coming from rather than pretending to be neutral arbiters if we're not. So I am center-right. I'm a conservative. I'm Trump skeptical, I think you could say. I do political reporting, analysis, and commentary at Fox News and at townhall.com as well. You did hear NPR, all things considered. They let me on from time to time, which is nice. I enjoy doing bubble busting exercises because I think sometimes we're in our own bubbles and that can be unhealthy. And one of the bubble busting exercises that I have enjoyed in the past, I've attended maybe 4 to 5 conferences on world affairs here at CU Boulder, which has been a learning experience. I have sat in this very ballroom on this very stage being outnumbered 4 to 1 on very low-key, uncontroversial issues like guns and abortion. And it was fine. A little hissing and booing never deterred me, but it's always great to be back in Colorado, to be back in Boulder, and I have to say, about 5 weeks ago, I just married a Coloradan, so it's a special treat to be here, although he went to school up the road in Fort Collins, so he was trying to get me to say go Rams. I'm like, no, it's go Buffs tonight, for sure. I have to ingratiate myself to the crowd. So right school, right conference, let's be clear. On this broader issue, so in my work, I'm a generalist. I am not an expert like either of these guys are. I like to think that I can think things through on my feet and ask fair questions, but I'm not an expert. My overall approach, again, in the interest of transparency, I believe that climate change is real. I believe that humans contribute to climate change very significantly. I believe taking action to combat climate change is morally the correct thing to do and something that we ought to pursue in terms of policy. I am skeptical of some of the government-centric solutions that are sometimes floated, just to put that out there. I'm also skeptical of doing so just as the United States if some of our global competitors don't have the same type of skin in the game. But I think because it is such an important issue, I'm very curious about what the right solutions look like. And I think what's exciting about an event like this tonight, we're not up here debating whether climate change exists. That is not what this debate's going to be. There's no one up here saying, it's a total hoax made up by China.
That's funny.
It's so true. It's very true. It's not true. So that's not the starting point, right? I think we'll tease this out a little bit, but we have something of a similar starting point. And then the question is, okay, how serious is the problem? What's the timeline? And what is realistic and correct to do about it? So with that, that's not a comprehensive take on what I believe, but I wanted to give you a sense of where I come from. My general goal tonight is to keep the train on the tracks, foster a good conversation, and let each of these gentlemen build their case in a fair way. So what we're going to do is start with opening statements. Each gentleman will have 15 minutes to...
20 minutes.
Oh, they told me 15.
They changed it.
20 sounds fine to me. I was not going to turn off your microphone, but I'd start like nudging you and then like maybe dousing you with some water, but 20 minutes it is. And then we'll go to some questions from me and then some questions from all of you. Well, maybe some of you. So we'll begin with Mr. Kennedy.
Right. I first want to start by apologizing for my voice. I used to have a very, very strong voice. And when I was 42 years old, I got struck by a neurological illness called spasmodic dystonia, and it makes my voice tremble. Usually, when I speak for a while, it flattens out a little and it becomes less painful for people to listen to. So I'm hoping that happens. Some days it's bad, some days it's good. Today is particularly bad. But I'm happy to be here. And the question that was presented, at least on the poster that I read for the first time today, should the government come in and abolish all fossil fuels? And I would have to say that that would not be my approach. I don't think that. I agree with Ben that that kind of aggressive government intervention would not have a good outcome. And I don't believe in that. I'm a very market-based person. I spent 35 years representing commercial fishermen who were capitalists and in love with a capitalist system and wanted it to work for them. I spent the last 20 years in the green tech space, at least for part of my time. I was involved with the construction of the biggest solar thermal plant, the concentrated solar plant in America, with one of my companies, and I also, one of my partners, I was a partner in a group that funded Tesla. We were the largest and first funder. Another group that I continue to advise and have a stake in has built the largest PV solar plant in North America. I've been involved in construction of transmission and wind and many other things. And I believe in markets. And I believe that the market will reply ultimately the best solution. Lord David Putnam gave a speech before Parliament about 10 years ago. When Parliament was debating, I believe that capitalism, people have asked me for 30 years, what's the best thing that could happen to the environment? And I always said the same thing. True free market capitalism, which we don't have in this country. We have corporate crony capitalism. Capitalism where if you want to bring a product to market, you pay all the costs of getting it there, including the cost of cleaning up your mess, which was a lesson we were all supposed to learn in kindergarten. Lord David Putnam gave a speech before Parliament, like I said, about 10 years ago. And Parliament was debating a cap and trade system that was designed to impose market discipline on the discharge of carbon. It was a way that was invented by conservatives, cap and trade. It was a way of saying, you're dumping your waste into the public commons, you ought to pay something for it. And something that will incentivize better behavior. That's how market works. And in Parliament, in England, virtually everybody understands the urgency of climate change. Very, very strong support for this law, and they ultimately passed it. There were vested interests in others who said, we have to be careful. We have to move incrementally. We can't move precipitously because it will crater the economy. Lord Putnam gave this wonderful speech where he reminded Parliament that 200 years before, the same body had debated the abolition of the slave trade. And at that time, everybody in England considered slavery a moral abomination, a cataclysm morally. They knew it had to be abolished. But again, people said, we can't do it suddenly because slavery represented 25% of the GNP of Great Britain, and it was the principal source of energy for the entire British Empire, free human labor. And they said, if we abolish it overnight, the economy is going to collapse. After a year of debate, Parliament made the moral choice and abolished slavery literally overnight, the slave trade. And instead of collapsing, the British economy exploded. as tens of thousands of entrepreneurs rushed into that space to create new forms of energy, mainly mechanical ones, in an era that we now know as the Industrial Revolution, which was the greatest epic in wealth creation in the history of mankind. And the abolition of slavery had exposed all of these hidden inefficiencies that were associated with free human bondage. Well, today, we don't need to abolish carbon to understand that our deadly addiction to it is the principal drag on American capitalism. The International Monetary Fund, which is not a liberal organization, says that the global subsidies to carbon today are $5.2 trillion. In the United States, we give subsidies to carbon $669 billion a year. That's more than we spend in our defense budget. It's 10 times what we spend on education. These are mature industries. Here, there may be an excuse for subsidizing to jumpstart an industry. These are 100-year-old industries. There's no excuse that any of them should have subsidies. In addition to the direct subsidies, we have all the indirect subsidies, the things that I think, Alex, don't exist with global warming, the ice caps melting, the wars, the acidification of the ocean. You know, my house today, my wife just called me before I walked in here, and to tell me that we are under evacuation in California because of the second time in 2 years. I represent, because the fire season lasts 2 months longer than it used to. I represent about 200 people who lost family members in the last fire or property. Yesterday, I was talking about Ben because he lives on Cape Cod too. I have a summer house on Cape Cod, and the public dock, which has been there for 65 years, has been destroyed 2 years in a row for the first time ever. We just got hit by a northeaster, and I showed him pictures of that dock. We're all living with it. You know, Alex has a daunting problem, which is, to me, a daunting challenge. He not only has to disagree with 120 years of science. You know, 120 years ago, scientists understood you put carbon in the atmosphere and warms it up. Exxon's own scientists, we now have their internal emails where they said this is going to heat the climate, it's going to melt the polar ice caps, and it's going to give us new drilling opportunities up there. But also, the insurance industry, which has its hair on fire, Swiss Re, Munich Re, biggest insurance companies in the world are saying this is the biggest threat to our business model. The military, the CIA, the Pentagon, report after report saying this is the biggest threat multiplier for the 21st century. So, but also just our common sense. He has to convince us not to believe our lying eyes. You know, I've been scuba diving for 60 years. I've watched the coral fields disappear. The frogs are gone, the salamanders are gone. My children are living in a different world than I lived in. We have river keepers in 44 countries. The glaciers are melting on every continent. This is not something that is going to happen in the future, it's something that's happening today. And not only the global warming issues that are part of that subsidy, that hidden subsidy, the wars, the mercury in our fish. There's now, I buy a fishing license for $30 every year. The New York State Constitution says that people in the state own the fish. But every freshwater fish in New York State has mercury levels that are dangerous to eat. 19 states, all the fish have advisories. 49 states, some of them. We're living in a science fiction nightmare because of carbon today. Because that mercury is coming from coal-burning power plants. I take my kids to the Adirondacks on the weekend. 20% of the lakes are dead. Zero life in them. Because of the acidification. All of the lakes on the high peaks of the Appalachians from Georgia to northern Quebec, acidified and dead. That's a cause. I work and have litigated for 30 years in West Virginia. I see the legacy and the cost of this industry to our public. We have cut down the 500 biggest mountains in West Virginia. The coal industry has flattened an area larger than the state of Delaware. 1,200 miles of rivers have been buried by fill. 2,500 poisoned. The water for almost all the major cities, Charleston and Morgantown, are poisonous. You can't drink them, you have to drink bottled water. This is a science fiction nightmare. This isn't something that's going to happen in the future. It's happening now. Now, here's the thing. Despite all these subsidies, we're still beating them in the marketplace. And I'm going to read something that I pulled up last night. Last year, I'll tell you something really quick. Amory Lovin showed me, he had two pictures he has. One was taken in New York at 38th Street, looking uptown, up Fifth Avenue, 1903. The other one, and there's, in that picture, there's 100 horse and buggies and one Model T Ford. He has another one taken in 1913, exact same photo. This one, there's 100 Model T Fords and one horse and buggy. What happened? What happened was, in a 10-year period, Henry Ford dropped the price of the Model T by 67%. That's all that happened. Well, guess what? The price of the solar panels has dropped by 80% in the last 5 years. And 5 years before that, another 80%. So here's what's happening. And this, last year, we built, despite all the subsidies to carbon, we built 63% of the new capacity, generated capacity on the globe was wind and solar, was renewable. Here, I'm going to read you what I pulled up from Bloomberg last night. Bloomberg, these are the prices for wind, solar, for all the energy sources. And this, Bloomberg tracks every transaction on the globe. These are super accurate numbers and up to date. Nuke, $267, a levelized cost on megawatt hour. What that means is the cost of financing the plant, the interest on the plant, the operation maintenance costs, the fuel costs all added up. 267. New coal, 112, about a half. New gas, combined cycle, $57, about half what coal is. Wind, $42, a third less, and gas. Subsidized wind, that's unsubsidized. Subsidized wind is $11, 1/5 the cost of gas. Utility scale solar, $26. So we could make energy if we wanted by burning prime rib. Why wouldn't we use the cheapest form of energy? And I'll tell you why. Not only because of the subsidies, even with the subsidies, we're beating them. But, oh well, let me do this quickly. Here's what's happening. I read an Alex book. I read your book last night.
Thank you.
Interesting. On the plane, I got here at 2 a.m., and I read your debate. Somebody gave me a transcript of your debate with Kevin. So in that you say, no coal plant has ever been displaced by renewable energy and never will. Here's what's happening on the ground.
That's not a quote, but
What?
I don't think I said and never will, but
You said in our lifetime. So here's what happened. NIPSCO, Indiana's biggest utility, is announced that it's closing its two biggest coal plants, and it's closing them to build new wind and solar because new wind and solar is cheaper than existing coal. Xcel, in this state, closing the Comanche plant for the same reason. In Iowa just announced that it is closed, the biggest utility in Iowa, it is buying 6 gigawatts of solar and wind power, mainly displays coal, and that company is owned by Warren Buffett, who is making a lot of his money on coal. So he's doing it because dollars and cents make sense. India just announced 2 weeks ago that it is canceling 14 gigawatts of new coal power because of the free fall in solar energy. 14 gigawatts is more than the entire coal fleet for Great Britain, which invented coal-burning power plants. So this is what's happening around the globe. The reason I said 63% of the new markets belong to us. The reason we don't have 100% is because the power of the incumbents, of coal, oil, and nuke, to block us from accessing the markets. They will not let independent power producers like my plants onto the marketplace. They do everything they can, and that's not fair. You know, I built a house in Mount Kisco, New York. I have solar power on the roof, state-of-the-art solar, and I have geothermal. My home is a power plant. I produce more energy than I use almost 365 days a year. When I'm away from that house, it's just a power plant. I ought to be able to sell my power to the power company the same as Con Ed does, or any other generator. So that's called net metering, and they have it in 42 states in one form or the other, but it's never actually pays you fairly. They'll pay, if energy produces that power, they'll pay them 13 cents a kilowatt hour. They'll only pay me 7. At the end of each month, they erase all my savings and start over again. That's not fair. We ought to have a market in this country, a fair market that does what a market is supposed to do, which is to reward good behavior, which is efficiency, and punish bad behavior, which is inefficiency and waste. Instead, we ought to have a market that allows every American, turns every American into an energy entrepreneur, every home into a power plant, and allows us to power this country on human ingenuity, what Franklin Roosevelt called America's industrial genius, rather than backing crude and Alberta tar sands and Appalachian coal. We ought to have a marketplace. Instead, we have a marketplace that is governed by rules that were written by the incumbents to reward the dirtiest, filthiest, most poisonous, most toxic, most warmongering fuels from hell, rather than the cheap, clean, green, wholesome, and patriotic fuels from heaven. Thank you.
With a few minutes to spare. Very efficient. Mr. Epstein, you're up.
All right. So I want to share with you a position tonight that is definitely not a position I ever expected to have when I was growing up. And that is the position that if we want more people in the world to have long, healthy, opportunity-filled lives, we need to continue our massive use of fossil fuels, and we actually need to expand it as a world. So you're definitely going to get a different opinion than you just heard. Now again, this is an opinion I never expected to have. Sometimes when people hear that, oh, you're really enthusiastic about fossil fuels, they think, oh, the industry must have paid you to do it, or maybe you grew up in Kentucky or something like that. So I didn't even know anyone in the fossil fuel industry when I came up with my ideas, and I grew up in a place called Chevy Chase, Maryland, which is a super liberal place. And the only thing I ever heard growing up about fossil fuels is that their CO2 emissions are causing global warming, which was a concern to me and which I still agree with to a certain extent. But I was never really interested in energy. My biggest interest in life was and still is philosophy, which many people consider the least practical subject in the world, and I consider the most practical subject, because philosophy is really about clear thinking methods. And I think that so much of this debate tonight is going to be about what is the proper method for thinking through this issue, and which person up on this stage is actually thinking about this issue clearly. So one key idea in philosophy is that whenever you're making a big decision in life, you need to look at the full impact of the decision. So that means you need to look at both the positive impacts and the negative impacts. And when you're considering a radical change to our way of life, you really need to make sure that you're considering the positives and the negatives. So for example, there are certain people who have a hostility toward vaccines and say that vaccines should be significantly restricted. And they say, well, look at all these side effects we're going to protect ourselves against if we restrict vaccines. And I would say, okay, that's legitimate to do as long as you're precise about the side effects and you don't exaggerate or distort them. But you also need to look at what are the benefits that you would lose by restricting vaccines. And I believe the same thing is true with fossil fuels. If we're considering dramatic restrictions of fossil fuels, and I believe this is something that Robert does advocate. He's publicly supported the Green New Deal. He's publicly supported Extinction Rebellion, which is basically like, let's instantly get off fossil fuels. So we're talking about at least a radical and rapid change. So I think we need to look at, okay, what are the side effects that we're going to be avoiding, particularly climate related, that's important. But we also need to look at what are the benefits that we might be losing. And for most of my life before I started studying energy, I didn't really think that there were any benefits that we would be losing, because I thought, well, like fossil fuels are pretty much interchangeable with other things, or we can use this clean, green, patriotic energy that we've heard so much about. Why are we still using these antiquated technologies? But when I started studying the issue, there were two things that I realized that really changed my perspective, both about how important the benefits of fossil fuels are and also how difficult to replace or substitute that they are. And so the first realization is that low-cost, reliable energy is far more important to the amazing way of life that we have and that billions of people aspire to than I realized. So low-cost, reliable energy is far more important to the amazing way of life that billions of us have and that billions of people aspire to than I realized. And then the second one is that low-cost, reliable energy is far more difficult to produce than I realized. So I want to start out with low-cost, reliable energy is really fundamental or indispensable to the amazing lives that we enjoy. And I really want to stress amazing lives that we enjoy, because you've been hearing about all the problems with the world and all of these bad things. And there are certainly problems in the world, but I think realization number one that we have to have is that we are unbelievably lucky to be alive right now. This is the greatest time to ever be a human being. If you look at a chart of what life expectancy was like throughout human history, it looks like a huge hockey stick. Thousands of years people are living below 30, and then 200 years ago it starts shooting up dramatically. So, average person can live to around 70 now. If you look at income, which is really close to how much opportunity do you have, that again is flat for so much of history and then goes way up. And so we live in a world that just has so much for billions of people, for certain people at least, has so much in terms of life expectancy and health and opportunity. So it's really important to recognize what is making that possible and make sure we don't make decisions that make it worse. And we also need to see how do you extend that to more people. And I never thought about energy as particularly important. I just thought, well, energy is just one thing among many. But then somebody pointed out to me, well, no, energy is different. It's more significant than you think, because the reason that we're so prosperous and have so much opportunity is that we've gone from being a manual labor civilization to a machine labor civilization. And what is energy? Energy is machine calories, machine food. So energy is what allows us to use machines to improve our lives. The lower cost energy is, the lower cost everything is. The higher cost energy is, the higher cost everything is. And that includes having a good environment. People often think, oh, the environment is great, and then all we've done is ruin it with all this toxic stuff. We live in the cleanest environment than anyone has ever lived in history in terms of sanitation, clean water. We have quite clean air throughout most of the United States. And a huge part of it is because we use energy, low-cost energy and machines to take the environment, which is naturally dirty and dangerous in many ways, and make it far cleaner and safer than it would otherwise be. So, low-cost, reliable energy, though. It has to be low cost and reliable, because if it's not low cost and reliable, then many people cannot afford it and take advantage of it. And here we run into a real issue. 3 billion people in the world lack low cost, reliable energy. You almost never hear about this, which is interesting because it's a fundamental tragedy. You have over 1 billion people in the world who have no electricity. You think about that. No electricity. So that's no refrigerators, no modern hospitals, no lights to study with, and we rarely talk about that. Almost 3 billion people in the world, their source of energy for heating and cooking is wood or animal dung, which has all kinds of toxic indoor air pollution. And yet we don't talk about this. So realizing how fundamental energy is to the amazing way of life that we enjoy, including the amazing environment we enjoy, and also that billions of people aspire to, made me really interested in, okay, how do we preserve and expand what we have in terms of low-cost, reliable energy, and also how do you expand that to as many people as possible? So that was the first realization. Now you might say, well, and Robert would say, well, like, what does that have to do with fossil fuels? And that's what I thought as well. Like, well, do we really need fossil fuels to do this? And this then connects to realization 2, which is that low-cost, reliable energy is far more difficult to produce than I thought. And I want to share with you 3 facts that changed my perspective on our energy choices. And I want to differentiate the kind of facts that I'm going to share tonight with the kind of alleged facts that Robert shared, in the sense of what I'm going to try to share with you are validated, big picture, empirical facts that tell you the overall picture of what's happening, or that's different than, oh, I read something in Bloomberg last night that said this, or this study said this. I want to show you the big picture of what's happening with energy and we'll talk about climate as well. And if you're interested in the sources on this, you can just go to fossilfueldebate.com, and I have all the documentation of everything you can see from nonpartisan sources. Okay, so fact number 1 is that over the last 200 years, entrepreneurs have tried to produce low-cost, reliable energy using many different fuels, including sun, wind, water, waves, tides, geothermal heat, wood, crops, uranium, thorium, and of course, oil, coal, and gas, the 3 so-called fossil fuels. So these have been around. There are lots of forms of energy that have been around for a long amount of time. And interestingly, we've heard for many decades that many of them are going to be the energy of the future. So interestingly, Robert mentioned Amory Lovins and how Amory Lovins just told him something really new and important about energy. Well, here's what Amory Lovins says. Recent research suggests that a largely or wholly solar economy can be constructed in the United States with straightforward soft technologies that are now demonstrated and now economic or nearly economic. So that sounds plausible, right? Except that was in 1976. Amory Lovins was saying, yeah, we don't need fossil fuels. We can do away with fossil fuels. He actually said, let's do away with most electricity, because who needs electricity? And guess what? Like, the internet needed electricity. A lot of things needed electricity. So people have a history of claiming, oh, all sorts of different forms of energy are going to work. But what is the actual reality? This leads us to fact 2. So despite the existence of many forms of energy production, fossil fuels are the energy of choice over 80% of the time, and are also the world's fastest growing energy source. So they're the energy of choice over 80% of the time. They're also the world's fastest growing energy source. Now, how do we reconcile that with what Robert said about solar and wind being the fastest growing energy source? And here I want to highlight a key aspect of looking at the full impact of our decisions, which is that we need to use precision and that we cannot use sloppiness. So there is, in the realm of energy, just a huge amount of distortion and sloppiness about the truth. And one of them involves the word capacity. So capacity is used to mean how much energy could a power plant produce if it worked to its full potential 100% of the time. So for a nuclear plant, that's a pretty, it'll be at 90% capacity. So if you hear the nuclear plant has 100 megawatts of capacity, okay, that basically means 100 megawatts. But for solar and wind, they operate at 30% of capacity because they're dealing with unreliable fuels. So if you're equating something that operates at 30% with something that operates at 90%, that is a distortion. So either you're not aware of that or you're misleading people. But we should not allow this kind of sloppiness and misrepresentation. So what is going on? Why are fossil fuels so dominant? Now, I should say that in terms of promising forms of energy, there have also been 2 prominent forms of energy that have shown some significant potential. And one is hydroelectric energy, which is great in terms of low-cost, reliable electricity. So it's good for electricity. It's not good for heavy-duty transportation fuel, which is what we need for agriculture and for shipping and for so many of the things that make our economy work. But most of all, we need it for food, because agriculture requires heavy-duty transportation energy. But nevertheless, hydro is good. It's limited by the number of hydro locations in the world. Interestingly, who are the biggest opponents of hydro? Not the big bad fossil fuel industry or the big bad, small bad, I guess, Alex Epstein. It is the modern environmental movement, including Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is a major opponent of hydroelectric energy. It's interesting how low-cost, reliable energy from those sources that's carbon-free or very low carbon is opposed by the people who claim to be concerned about carbon. The most promising alternative to fossil fuels in the last 50 years has been nuclear power, because nuclear power, you can build it anywhere. It doesn't do heavy-duty transportation except for like aircraft carriers and submarines, but nevertheless, it's shown amazing potential to actually, in reality, give low-cost, reliable energy to a lot of people. And it was really growing in this country and doing some pretty amazing things until guess what happened? It was demonized and criminalized by the modern environmental movement, the same people who claim to care about CO2 emissions. So places like France are getting 70% of their electricity from nuclear, and at, say, half the price of Germany, which is getting 5% of its total energy from solar and wind, but has still doubled its electricity prices because of that. And yet there is this bias against nuclear. So this will be an interesting thing to talk about. Why is the modern environmental movement that claims to be so concerned about CO2, why are they so hostile in particular to nuclear? Now, this raises the question, though, why are fossil fuels so dominant? And I think the key is it's actually really hard to produce low-cost, reliable energy for all the different things we need it for billions of people around the world. And the reason is because energy is a process. To use energy, we have to take some form of raw energy like the sun or the wind or coal or oil. We need to go through a whole set of steps to get it to an end user to, say, run a harvester. Now, why do solar and wind have so much difficulty? This leads me to fact 3, which is that solar and wind depend on backup from reliable fuels, and the more they are used, the more expensive energy is. So if you look at, and this will be on fossilfueldebate.com, so you can see the specific data, but there's a very strong correlation between the percentage of solar and wind that countries use, which is almost always mandated, by the way, and their electricity prices. So it's like the higher percentage of solar and wind they're using, the more their electricity prices go up. Now, why is this? You hear all these stats like, oh, solar panels are going down in price, but you have to look at the whole process to produce it. And the lie behind all these claims about solar is they're just taking one part of the process, the solar panel, and they're saying, oh, the solar panel is cheap, therefore the whole process is cheap. That's not honest. You have to look at the whole process. And what happens is, because solar and wind are unreliable fuels, you need a process that turns unreliable fuels into reliable energy. What that means in practice, because batteries are so expensive, and they're all built by fossil fuels, by the way, is that you need 100% backup from reliable fuels, which is usually coal, gas, or nuclear. Well, because the unreliable fuels can go to almost zero at any given time, you need 100% backup from a reliable fuel energy system. Well, guess what? If you need to pay for the reliable, 100% reliable energy infrastructure and unreliable energy infrastructure, which is going to be cheaper? To just have the reliable energy infrastructure, or to add on this whole other unreliable energy infrastructure? Obviously more expensive with the unreliable energy infrastructure. So this is what happens in practice. So there's all these accounting gimmicks, but the truth is, the more you use it, the more energy costs, and also it is dependent on the reliable fuels. So I am the biggest enthusiast of competition and innovation, and that's why I'm so enthusiastic about, say, pursuing nuclear and pursuing other forms of energy. But it's very wrong to favor only one form of energy, these so-called renewables, or really the unreliable renewables, because most of the environmental movements against hydro, like, that is a really irrational policy. That's not a pro-market policy. That's an this is really an anti-energy policy. So the conclusion is, nuclear has a lot of potential. It's been held back decades. Given the current state of energy and the current need for energy, the quality of life in the wealthy world and the poor world in the next several decades requires continued massive fossil fuel use. I mean, if we want to continue our way of life and also expand that to billions more people, there's just nobody has close to the ability to provide that energy for that many people. We should get started on alternatives, again, by stopping the demonization and criminalization of nuclear, and we should allow solar and wind to compete without a whole bunch of special privileges that they have. But fossil fuels are going to be really, really crucial. And if we have significant radical restrictions, I know Robert said he only read the debate title today. I'm not sure whose responsibility that is, But he does advocate, and more importantly, our culture advocates radical restrictions on fossil fuels. You see, in Colorado, you're talking about going fossil free. The Green New Deal is talking about 100% renewable. That means fossil fuel use is outlawed. It's not saying, oh, we have a lot of optimism because Robert F. Kennedy is bankrolling some really effective companies and they have a lot of promise. That would be terrific. It's that by X year, we are not allowed to use fossil fuels. And that is really, really catastrophic. So if we radically restrict fossil fuels, we lose basically the modern way of life for billions of people. Now there's a question, what about the side effects? And that's what I want to talk about now. It might be worth it. Maybe climate is such a bad thing that we need to take a huge hit to our standard of living. But make no mistake, reducing fossil fuel use dramatically means a big hit to our standard of living. So when we're talking about climate, it's crucial to be precise. And so there's a difference between believing that we cause some warming, which is what I believe, and that we cause runaway catastrophic warming. And so I want to give you 3 other facts that changed my perspective, again, available at fossilfueldebate.com. So fact number 1 is that environmental thought leaders have been predicting imminent climate doom for 30 plus years. So when you hear, oh my gosh, the world is going to end, we have 12 years left, well, it turns out that those claims have been made for 30 to 50 years. So just to give you one example, President Obama's leading science advisor, John Holdren, said in the mid-1980s it's possible that carbon dioxide, climate-induced famines could kill as many as 1 billion people before the year 2020. Or in 1989, the UN said that entire nations could be wiped off the face of the earth by rising sea levels if the global warming trend is not reversed by the year 2000. So clearly these apocalyptic scenarios didn't happen, but you might think, well, it's getting really bad. Right? We can't ignore that. Well, this leads to fact number 2, which is that human beings are safer from climate today than we've ever been. And nobody believes this, but there's actually a data point which I've brought up in my book, and I've brought it up in debates, and no green movement person has ever been able to answer this because it's from the International Disaster Database. And what it does is track how many people are actually dying from storms and flood and heat and cold. Not an anecdote about, oh, a neighbor of mine died and so it's getting worse. No, how many people are dying? And what actually happened is in the 1930s, you had millions of people a year in many of those years dying, 10 million a year adjusted for population. When my book came out, it was in 2014, it was 30,000 climate-related deaths. So there's a huge decrease. And then people think, oh, it must have gotten worse. So last year, there were 5,625 total climate-related deaths. Now, how is this possible? There are 2 basic reasons. One is that the people who are predicting doom, they ignore the fact that low-cost, reliable energy from fossil fuels and the industrial civilization they power protects us from climate dramatically. Climate is not naturally safe and we make it dangerous. It's naturally dangerous and we make it safe. So what we've done is we've made our climate far safer by having this amazing fossil-fueled civilization. The other thing, though, is that not only did they ignore the huge climate protection benefits of fossil fuels, they dramatically exaggerated and distorted the side effects, just like people do with vaccines. So this leads to fact number 3, which is that while prominent models and thought leaders have predicted runaway warming and rapid sea level rises, we have experienced warming of only 2 degrees Fahrenheit in the last 150 years, with sea level rises that are very slow compared to our ancestors. So it's not that we haven't caused any, I'm not saying we haven't caused any warming, I'm saying we've caused some warming, but the people who are publicizing it, at least, are you telling me I'm out of time? I have 1 more minute. No, I timed it exactly. It says 19 minutes. I wanted to make sure I didn't get screwed. Okay, and so I get that 17 seconds back too. So I got 1 more minute according to my clock. Okay, so what's actually happening is in the world is, yes, we're having an influence, but that influence is far milder and more manageable. So what we're having is a very manageable side effect with an amazing benefit. So the conclusion is that fossil fuels are making our lives amazing and that they can make our lives even more amazing, and that the way to make our lives most amazing is to have energy freedom, including stop the demonization and criminalization of nuclear by the green movement, allow all forms of energy to compete, and allow billions of people to have prosperity by using the best energy sources for their lives. So I believe that is the path forward for the future, and I look forward to diving into some of the specifics, and I think you'll see where the truth is. Thank you.
And the gentleman yields back the remaining 3.72 seconds of his time as he was calculating. So I want to start, before we get into some of the significant substance that we just heard about and some of those disagreements. I did some of my throat clearing myself earlier about my own vantage point on some of this, my own job. There are elephants in the room, so as we prepared for this event, I went online to read some of the comments about this event before it happened. It's always an uplifting and edifying experience reading online comments, and there were some themes that came up from time to time, and I thought it's important to at least address them and acknowledge them out of the gate, and then we can move to substance. So for Mr. Epstein, there were a lot of people who were going along the lines of saying you really shouldn't have a platform on an issue this serious because you are a science denier, right? So Rolling Stone listed you among the climate change denier elite a number of years ago. You've been quoted praising the oil industry as producing the lifeblood of civilization. I think you agree with that, but I think a lot of people blanch at that type of framing. Your critics, as I said, call you a science denier, say that you have personally profited from or gotten money from or been funded by big oil, big coal, Koch brothers. They note that you cheered the since ousted EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt as heroic early on in the Trump administration. So when you hear people try to disqualify you, because that's a lot of what our, and this is for both sides, a lot of our political debates these days are trying to disqualify the other person out of the gate so we don't really get into the substance. It's sort of part of cancel culture and the deplatforming movement. When people say to you that it's problematic that you have a personal financial stake in undermining science or undermining sound public policy, what's your response to those critiques?
Yeah, so I think that there are two important criticisms here. So one is the science denier criticism and the other is the shill criticism. And they're somewhat related, but I think they're different. So the science denier position is just somebody is saying your position is somehow anti-science. And so I tried to explain that earlier in terms of, no, my position is very pro, look at the science as precisely as possible and integrate it so that we understand the full impact of different choices. So like, just as like if you're looking at vaccines, you need to look at the science about the side effects and the science about the benefits. So with fossil fuels, you need to look very precisely at the science about the side effects, the science about the benefits. And that includes things like not exaggerating, not distorting things, not like that capacity fallacy, not equating mild warming with catastrophic warming, not saying 97% of scientists agree with catastrophic warming when they only agreed with mild warming. Like these kinds of things are really important. So I regard myself as a science lover and somebody who really respects science and its proper role. In terms of the funding thing, I should say that although I don't get funding from the industry, I think that people involved in the industry should speak up a lot more. People, being funded from the industry, what does that mean? I mean, that just means that they're producing energy and we're buying it. And I think we should absolutely hear from those people, and I wish we would hear more from them. My own background, as I said, is I came to this issue from totally outside the industry. I didn't even know anyone in the industry. But what I did do is I wanted to build a business in terms of promoting my ideas. And so I decided the way to do it was I wanted full independence, as much independence as I could get. So I didn't do the conventional nonprofit where you raise money from different people and they have some kind of influence. I decided to do a for-profit business where basically I charge people for my ideas. So like I'll come to a place like this and say, well, you can pay me for my ideas. And the thing that I do with different industries, but particularly mostly the fossil fuel industry, as I say, in cases where I agree with you on policy, if you pay me, I'll help you get better messaging. But my goal is to help them use my ideas effectively. So it's the opposite of they're paying me to say what they think. No, they're paying me to tell them what they should say. And that's something I'm really proud of. And I think if you grasp the arguments that I've made today and the evidence that I've given, I think the fossil fuel industry is an amazing benefactor of human life. Certainly there are plenty of mistakes and plenty of individual bad people. But of course I'm proud to be associated with the industry. And I would be proud to be funded by them in the conventional sense. I just happen not to be.
Okay, and Mr. Kennedy, you frequently appeal to the authority of science, as we heard in your initial presentation, and yet, quite controversially, as Alex has alluded to a few times, you've engaged in what critics call anti-vax conspiracies. Those critics include several prominent members of your own family who publicly condemned you on this subject in May, calling you, quote, tragically wrong in a Politico op-ed, which also accused you of helping to, quote, spread dangerous misinformation over social media and being, quote, complicit in sowing distrust of the science behind vaccines. Others note that you have a large personal carbon footprint relative to most people on the planet. What's your response when people suggest that your commitment to science is perhaps selective and that your lifestyle could be hypocritical?
Well, let me first answer the question that you asked him about whether people should be able to censor him because, Alex, because they don't like what he says. I'm offended by that. I think any American should be offended by it. You know, I don't agree with him, but he has a right to make his argument, and we ought to be able to process those arguments in the market of debate, and you know, it's anti-American, it's anti-democratic. Democracies don't work unless you have free flow of information. I don't agree with a lot of the things that have been happening on the campuses where people are, you know, are shutting down speakers because they're controversial. He has a right to make his point. And I would defend that right till, you know, to the end, because that's what we do in this country. I want to take maybe my time, but maybe the 2 minutes that I had left over to address some of the things some of the things that were said about me by Alex, and also the challenge he put up about that nobody's been able to answer the question on his graph about why carbon has gone up in lockstep with a decline in climate deaths. The answer is, and you can no longer say nobody gave you the answer. The answer is because the two things have nothing to do with each other. It's called correlation, not causation. The reason climate deaths have gone down is because we're better at forecasting, we're better at disaster relief, we have radios, we have televisions. I had friends who were in Grand Bahamas. They survived because they knew what was happening and what was coming, and that's why climate deaths. If you really want to know the answer to that question about whether there's a relationship between use of carbon and injury or disasters, you need to look at property damage, and you'll see it's gone sky high in lockstep with carbon. Are you going to ask about nuke later? Because he
yes.
Okay, so I won't do that, but I also just want to respond to one other thing he said. There's 1.3 billion people in this world who don't have energy, and they're not going to get it unless we do it with carbon. That's exactly the opposite of true. Those are people who were left behind by the carbon economy. These are the people that I deal with in my work. They're people in remote areas who will never get carbon because you can't build a pipeline to them. Nobody's going to do it. You can build a road, and then you can give them an oil boiler, and you have to ship oil to them, and nobody's going to do it because they have no money. The solution for them is solar panels and distributed power. It's not carbon. It would be a terrible, terrible investment for us to invest in carbon. Now I'll talk about vaccines. And by the way, I agreed to this debate. I would love it if somebody would debate me on the subject of vaccines. And since it seems to be a great interest of yours, I challenge you to debate me on it. And I'm going to tell you just what my position is. And my position is not anti-science. My position is exactly aligned with the National Academy of Science and the Institute of Medicine. People don't know my position because people call me an anti-vaxxer, but I'm not. I'm pro-vaccine. I had all my children vaccinated. I believe the vaccine should be tested, safety tested. People don't know. You cannot sue a company that makes vaccines that injures you. No matter how egregious the injury is, no matter how negligent that company was, no matter how toxic the ingredient. Furthermore, they're completely insulated, so there's no incentive for them to make vaccines safe. Furthermore, they're also exempt. They're the only medicine that's exempt from safety testing. So now, one of the 72 vaccines currently given to our children, mandated, has ever been tested against a placebo. That means nobody knows what the risk profile is, and nobody can say with a scientific certainty if that vaccine is averting more problems than it causes. And I don't think that we ought to be mandating medical interventions for unwilling Americans unless we know precisely that that vaccine is going to end up helping people rather than hurting them. The Institute of Medicine is the ultimate arbiter of vaccine science, according to Congress and HHS. And the Institute of Medicine has time and again in 1991, 1994, 2011, 2014 has scolded and rebuked and screamed at CDC for not doing safety testing on any of these vaccines. And we've seen the vaccine schedule. I had 3 vaccines when I was a kid. My children got 72. It changed in '89, and if you were born prior to '89, your chance of having a chronic disease, rheumatoid arthritis, diabetes, autism, food allergies, is 12%. If you were born after '89, it is 54% according to HHS. And nobody's explaining where is it all coming from? Where is all the autism coming from if it's not vaccines? Why is it in my generation 1 in 2,500 kids had autism, and in this generation 1 in 34? CDC is supposed to tell us where the diseases are coming from. Why is it in my generation 1 in 400 kids had food allergies, peanut allergies, and 1 in 10 today? And guess what? Look at the vaccine inserts. All of the 400 diseases that are now epidemic in our children.
All right. So we're a bit over time. It could be.
I didn't want to have this conversation, but I'm not going to shy away from it.
Okay. So we've had our say on those 2 issues, or most of those 2 issues. Let's move on to my next question. It seems clear, based on both of your passion, that you are concerned about the well-being of all people on this planet, and particularly the world's indigent populations. Mr. Epstein has argued that a premature curtailing of fossil fuels will prevent sorely needed economic development and could have a regressive effect on the poor. Mr. Kennedy has argued that climate change could have a disproportionately devastating effect on the poor. So you both want to help people. You both want to make sure that vulnerable populations are safe and able to flourish. Can you each discuss why you believe the risk balance tips in the direction of your worldview on this? And perhaps as sort of a corollary, is there evidence that you would need to see in order to convince you that you were wrong about which side has the better case? And we'll start with Mr. Epstein.
Sorry, I don't want to keep going to this, but the vaccine thing, so I want to just make clear on my position on the vaccines. No. My position is it's a model. That I did not say anything about Robert's specific view of vaccines. I'm interested in his view, but it's not an expertise. I'm bringing up vaccines as a model of we need to look at the full impact of things with precision. So he's claiming to be doing that. I have suspicions about that. I'm certain he's not doing it with energy, but that was a model. It's not to say I want to have
Let's debate it. Agree to debate me.
No, because I don't have specific knowledge about
well, then
vaccines.
Stop attacking me.
I was not attacking. No, I just said I'm attacking you for distorting energy.
On it, or
no, we're having a debate on energy, which you are distorting, as I've demonstrated and will continue to demonstrate. Okay, so let's go to the subject. Thank you, audience advisor. Okay, so let's. Okay, I'll give you a check from Big Oil, my best friend. Okay, so let's talk about why is it that I think that that the freedom, and I want to stress, the freedom to continue using fossil fuels is essential. So I'm not saying we need to have a law that prevents certain people in certain places from having solar panels. I'm all for that. I don't want that to be forced on people. And so why do I think that it's so important for people to be able to use fossil fuels? Well, basically, my entire opening, that energy, that low-cost, reliable energy is indispensable for people to have the ability to flourish. So that's point one. And point two is the fossil fuels are a unique source of this in terms of that can provide low-cost, reliable energy for all of our different uses, including heavy-duty transportation, on a scale of billions of people. And I think the history here is really instructive, because what I find in a lot of these debates is you hear a lot of people making claims about the future. And it's really, the track record is really important. And the track record that for decades people have been saying, oh yeah, renewables can easily replace fossil fuels, and particularly saying we're going to have mass death and devastation from climate. And then the fact that actually fossil fuels were by far the most effective way to get a lot of energy for a lot of people, and that devastation hasn't happened in part because people empowered by fossil fuels protected themselves more against climate. That's very, very relevant. And so if you look at let's look at just China and India, like a combined almost 2.5 billion people, where you've had quintupling or more of fossil fuel use in the last 40 years, and life expectancy increases of at least 7 years. So you think about 2.5 billion people have industrialized using fossil fuels and extended their lives by at least 7 years. That is really fundamental. Whereas, and as I said, like climate, in terms of its actual impact on human life, the claims about disaster damages, those are wrong. We'll put those on fossilfueldebate.com, and also we'll do a podcast on Wednesday, like going into the sources and all this stuff. But if you look up Roger Pielke Jr., I believe is affiliated with this. He's kind of the expert on actual climate damages, so you can look at that. But in terms of climate-related deaths, remember, it was forecast that millions of people would be dying, and yet it's not happening because we're building a durable civilization. So I think it's clear that the benefit to poor people is huge, and there's no reason to think that poorer people around the world can't do what China and India did, and actually with modern technology and best practices do it a lot more cleanly. So I think it's just totally clear that the freedom to use fossil fuels is essential, and that taking away that freedom is really, I mean, I regard it as energy genocide.
Your response to that?
One thing is, Alex, you're using a lot of debating tricks, which is, and one of them is using conflating the word energy with oil interchangeably, and it's not. I believe we should have energy. I think we should use the cheapest kind of energy. You made the statement earlier that I somehow, did some kind of bait and switch when I was talking about the pricing of energy, and you dismissed Bloomberg, which, Bloomberg is the leading authority on energy. It looks at every single transaction. The costs I was giving you are levelized costs. That means all the fuel, all the operation and maintenance, it is all of the capitalization, and that's the cost. That is the only way of making a fair cost, and they're cheaper. It's 1/10 the cost of nuke. So why wouldn't we, isn't it better for poor people if we use the cheapest energy? Doesn't it mean we can get to more poor people? I want to say this. I work with poor communities. I see what happens, what we call the oil curse. If you have oil, I just came from Cancer Alley. There's 1 million people between Baton Rouge and New Orleans who have poisoned water. Their lives are not good. I do a lot. I've been 30 years, I've been litigating in West Virginia. When I was a little boy, my father said to me, talked to me about mountaintop removal. It was just called strip mining, and they were just starting. He said they're not only doing it to cheapen their mining, but they're doing it to get rid of workers. And he told me that in 1968, there were 114,000 unionized mine workers in West Virginia. Today, there's 11,000 miners left in this state, and very few of them, probably a quarter of them, are unionized. They're mining with machines that cost $500 million, are 22 stories high, and practically dispense with the need for human labor. And West Virginia is the richest state in this country. If you look at the coal beneath the ground, if you look at the people, it's the poorest. It has the worst education system. It has the worst health care. It has the worst of everything. The water is poison, the air is poison, and the people are demoralized and beaten, and that is the legacy of carbon.
So I feel like obviously there's disagreements about some of the measuring sticks here and what is cheaper and what's more affordable and what isn't. One of the key questions in this debate is what should be done about it from the level of the US federal government, right? And the jurisdiction that we have, the sovereignty that we have. And you get these generally kind of superficial arguments about government intervention versus the free market. And I guess my question is, what is the proper role for the federal government on this issue versus the role of private industry? So one argument, Mr. Epstein, would be if climate change is an existential crisis, which is something that many people believe, whether you dispute it or not, many people, especially younger people, believe that, right? Mm-hmm. And so if people in their core believe that to be true, wouldn't that justify a dramatic governmental intervention of some sort? And that's point one. And point two, what in your mind is appropriate for the government to do in this overall realm?
You mean with the doomsday scenario or not, in the second part? So you're saying assume doomsday.
So I guess, so if people believe it's doomsday,
yeah,
right, would that justify massive government intervention? And then based on what you think is actually happening, what should the government do and not do?
Yeah, I mean, so, but I think it's, I mean, you can do this hypothetical, like if it's doomsday, but the main thing is people need to understand what actually drives like what I call human flourishing. So long, healthy, opportunity-filled lives. I think the core reason people think there's doomsday is because they have the view that basically the planet is perfect in its natural state, and then anytime we impact it, there's this delicate balance, and we're going to upset the balance, and it's going to go haywire. And I think it's really important that that's not how the planet works at all. The planet is wild potential. It is not, it's not stable. It doesn't give us sufficient stuff for our needs. We need to transform it. It's not safe. So we need to dramatically impact the planet to meet our needs and to provide for a lot of people. And so that takes energy, and you want to use the lowest cost, most reliable energy. And most of the time when people are in reality, that's fossil fuels for people. So this is really important, because if you're talking about doomsday, you need to realize that the thing that makes our amazing lives possible, and I keep wanting to stress, we have unprecedented amazing lives, is this low cost, reliable energy. If you just take out that one variable, with all the knowledge and all the technology we have, if you don't have low cost, reliable energy powering your machines, nothing works. You can have all the knowledge in the world, all the technology. If those machines don't have calories, nothing works. So we should be afraid of doomsday from energy restrictions. That's why I call it energy genocide, from these prohibitions that will deprive people of the energy that they need to live and thrive, let alone deprive people of new opportunities. So it's really important that it's crazy that people see, 2 degrees Fahrenheit warming in 150 years. Oh my gosh, the world is going to end. And people talk about policies that will cause blackouts and worse, and are already starting to cause blackouts, and are already starting, by the way, in Europe, to cause people to die from hypothermia in greater numbers because their energy is more expensive. Like, the actual world being good depends on low-cost, reliable energy. It does not depend on specific climate conditions. If we have low-cost, reliable energy, we can deal with any climate conditions almost. If we don't, we can deal with no climate conditions. Now, if there was something like an incredibly rapid rise in sea level, and in something really dramatic that was really existential, yes, the government should do something about it. But the pro-human way would be to really look at what is demonstrated to work and what's most effective. And the thing you would do, the thing you would obviously do, given the actual record of nuclear in terms of how much energy costs, or electricity costs nuclear, is the first thing you do is try to build out the whole world with nuclear power plants. That would be the obvious thing that you would do if you cared. You wouldn't keep making promises about these unreliable fuels being able to transform everything, even though in reality they always add cost, because for the obvious reason that you always have to add the unreliable energy infrastructure to the reliable energy infrastructure. So I don't know if I'm out of time, and I want to respect time, but you really need to realize low-cost, reliable energy, that's the thing you should be afraid of losing. You should not be afraid of fairly modest changes in climate conditions. The temperature of this planet used to be 25 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than it is today. CO2 levels used to be at least 10 times higher. We're not in some unprecedented territory for the planet, but we have an unprecedented good life because we have an amazing ability to produce energy using fossil fuels. And I hope that people outcompete it, but to prohibit it is energy genocide.
So on the competition.
Well, let me answer the question. Let me put a pin right here that everything Alex said that I understood, I disagree with. But then I want to answer the question, which is what should government be doing? I don't believe that Alex trying to put words in my mouth that I want to outlaw fossil fuels. No, I want to create markets. That's the American ideal. We ought to create fair markets where every American can participate. And we did this with the internet. In 1979, we passed the bill that created the ARPANET. The federal government built the infrastructure for a marketplace. In 1980, a year later, the CEO of IBM said that personal computers are a dead-end technology, and they got out of the business. 1980. Well, what happened? Because we had a marketplace, everybody got a personal computer, and what happened to the cost of information, of bits and bytes? It plummeted to zero. If I want to know what Mao Zedong's favorite lunchtime meal is, I can look it up on Google. You know how much that information would have cost you before they did that? You would have had to go to the Library of Congress and spend a week in the stacks. But today, it's free information forever because we created the market. 1996, we passed the Telecommunications Act. And Bill Clinton said all the baby bells have to unify. Everybody gets on. The lowest cost providers prevail in the marketplace. That's why we all have cell phones in our pockets that can do all this stuff. And what happened to phone calls? When I started working at Pace, there was only one phone call in the campus where you were allowed to make overseas calls. It cost $75 to call London. Kids don't believe this. It's free phone calls forever because we built a market. That's what's going to happen if we build a market for energy, a real market, and not one where the incumbents can block access to people like me. Because you know what? They have their coal is, what is that, 5 minutes or 2 minutes or what? 2 minutes. 2 minutes. Their coal costs money. Their oil, it costs today about $1 billion a gigawatt to build a solar plant. It costs $5 billion to build a coal plant, but then you got to pay for the coal. You got to cut down the Appalachians, shut them across the country, earn the coal, poison every fish with mercury, kill 18,000 people a year with ozone and particulates, sterilize all the lakes in the Adirondacks, and do all these other bad things. The photons are hitting the Earth every day for free. All we have to do is build the infrastructure to allow people to harvest them and then to sell them back on the grid. And you know what's going to happen? We're going to have free energy forever. And we have the best solar energy in the world in this country. The Scientific American said if we put solar panels on an area 75 miles by 75 miles in the desert Southwest, we produce 3 times the amount of energy that for the entire North American grid. We have more wind. We're the Saudi Arabia of wind. We have enough wind in Montana, harnessable wind, Texas and North Dakota, to power the entire American grid. So all we need to do is build the marketplace, and then we get free energy forever because there's no fuel costs. And what happens? Then it releases the energy of our country. It's like a permanent tax break for every business and every American, and it democratizes the grid. Other than concentrating that power and making a few billionaires and impoverishing the rest of us.
So I think the idea of creating the marketplace and allowing true competition, that speaks my language, right? That's something that's very compelling to me. I guess part of the question is, when you look at policy proposals like the Green New Deal, for example, we didn't get this amazing explosion of cell phone technology, cellular technology, by outlawing payphones, right? We didn't outlaw typewriters to have computers advance massively.
Right.
Green New Deal.
I disagree with that approach. I think we ought to have markets.
So you think the Green New Deal, you don't support the Green New Deal?
There's probably parts of it that I support. Putting a price on if you need to discharge a pollutant like carbon, you ought to pay a price for it. And so that, I believe we need to get rid of externalities. Alex doesn't seem to know what an externality is, because he thinks this is cheap energy, that, coal is 11 cents a kilowatt, it's the cheapest. You're paying for the coal roads and the mercuries and the wars and all this other stuff out of your other pocket. It's just coming out of your income tax. You're not paying it at the pump. It's coming out of you're still paying it.
So let's go there. I want you to respond to that, and also I'm going to throw in one extra question of my own, which is this. One of the words that you keep using is reliable when talking about energy sources, and Robert has mentioned the major advances in solar technology. It seems to me that the sun is quite reliable, and I wonder, is that something when we talk about expanding our capability technologically, is solar something that you think has a high ceiling to eventually replace perhaps carbon?
Okay, but I have 3 minutes. These are two big questions. I mean, are we relying on the sun right now? Like, what do you mean? I mean, reliable means. So
it'll be back in a few hours, and we know when it'll be.
Okay, let me deal with that one quickly, since I think it's pretty straightforward, and then remind me of the other. Oh, I want to deal with the externalities, because that's much more substantive issue. When I say reliable, it means reliable for your purposes. So modern life that has been created mostly by fossil fuels is we are used to and have built our lives around having low-cost energy on demand so that we can use amazing machines to improve our lives at all times. Like if you want to run an incubator for a baby, you want to be able to do it all the time. You want to be able to turn the lights on anytime. You want to be able to have a respirator work anytime. So when you have a stored fuel, then you can rely on it for on-demand energy. When you have an intermittent flow, you can rely that it'll be there sometimes, but it'll mostly not be there when you need it. And then there's this question of backup. And so I've discussed that, and I've discussed how that's the key to why it always jacks up the price, and why it's dependent, and why it doesn't actually work in practice very well. In terms of, so there's a question of like, does it have a high ceiling? I think the highest ceiling is going to be from nuclear, just because nuclear is so naturally concentrated a form of energy. Solar is always limited because it's very dilute. You need a lot of space to harness it. But I want to talk about externalities. And I'm glad, Robert, you brought this up, because I forgot to address what you said in your opening statement. You mentioned the IMF, International Monetary Fund, and you mentioned that they had they said, well, there are $5.2 trillion in subsidies. So it's really interesting to look up what that means, because a subsidy means, and this is the kind of subsidy solar and wind gets, it means basically the government and some of the companies that you bankroll and maneuver for, like BrightSource and stuff, like when they get subsidies, that means like the government is basically giving them money. They're like paying them money, and so ultimately we are paying extra money for the energy. And so if you look at, say, the Energy Information Administration, it will say that solar and wind get 14 times more subsidies than all forms of energy. So that in terms of like, that's what a real subsidy means, giving people money. Now there's this other idea that I'm going to calculate what I believe are all the negative consequences of this, and I'm not going to, that people aren't paying for, but I'm not going to calculate what are called the positive externalities, all the benefits that people aren't paying for. So whenever you're doing stuff, there's certain benefits people are paying for, there's certain benefits they're not paying for, and there's certain harms that people aren't paying for. And what happens with these externality calculations is they only look at negatives, so it's this same kind of bias, only looking at the negatives, and then they have huge free reign to make up anything they want. And a good indication is the IMF calculation, I believe in 1 year, it increased by $2 trillion. So 1 year they said, I don't have the exact number, something like 3 trillion, and the next year they say 5 trillion. And so what's happening is they're just making up models that are saying, we're only gonna look at the negatives, and we're gonna make up all these crazy scenarios, and then we're gonna blame you now. And what they're saying in effect is, yeah, you think that this energy is low cost, but it's not. Actually, it's totally ruining your life. But how does that square with the fact that the more of this stuff we use, the longer and better lives we get? So what's happening is people are completely inflating and distorting the so-called negative externalities and completely ignoring and evading the positive externalities. This is what happens all the time with fossil fuels, and for that matter with nuclear. People are ignoring the amazing benefits and they're exaggerating and distorting the side effects. So actually what is happening in the world, and so the climate-related deaths are an indication of this. People are saying, yeah, you need to calculate negative externalities because there's going to be all this massive suffering and death. And then it doesn't happen because in part of all these positive externalities of fossil fuels. So the world is getting much better, which means that there are a lot more of these positive externalities than there are negative externalities. And so it's pseudoscience to say, oh yeah, coal should, so here's an interesting question for Robert, like what should a gallon of gasoline cost? Because in Europe, it's something like, I don't know, $10 a gallon, so it's already about twice what we pay, and yet solar and wind have not dominated there. They haven't revolutionized there. They still use gasoline. So there's a question of, basically what he's saying is not that he has a really cheap way of producing energy or that there is one on the market. He's saying, let's make fossil fuels unbelievably expensive and then everything will be great. And no, if you make fossil fuels unbelievably expensive, everything will be unbelievably expensive. So no, actually fossil fuels are low cost, and the externality argument basically means there is no real low cost energy like we're used to available, so we should just make, I don't know, what should gasoline cost?
So let's address that.
Well,
Positive
yeah.
externalities, are you ignoring a huge part of the equation?
No, of course positive externalities, this is kind of a sophomoric view, of course they're measured economically. It's called profits. That's what they're selling us, and they're charging us for it. So, and you know, here's what I would say about gasoline. What is the true cost of gasoline? If we have to go to Saudi Arabia, punch holes in the ground, bring up the oil, refine it expensively, genuflect to the sheiks who despise democracy and are hated by their own people, and don't let women drive cars, and cut off American journalists' bone saws. Is that a good thing for our country? And then take that oil, bring it across the Atlantic with a military escort that, guess what? Exxon doesn't pay for, you and I do. And spill it all over Valdez, spill it all over the Gulf, and leave us with the cleanup bill. And burn the oil, produce 3 ozone particulates and benzene, toluene, and xylene that cost our healthcare system and respiratory and cardiac illnesses every year $365 billion. So, and then get in periodic wars. The last one we got in cost $3 trillion. That's part of the cost of oil. When the World Trade Center came down, that's part of the cost of oil, because we put our troops in Saudi Arabia to protect their oil wells. Why would we do that? Why is America doing that? Shouldn't we be making our own energy right here where we've got a huge abundance of it and taking that money and putting it in schools? We ought to have a price of gasoline. We ought to have a price of gasoline at the pump that reflects all that cost. We're paying for $200 million, $200 billion a year to protect the infrastructure in the Gulf of Hormuz. Why are we doing that? We're not even using that oil anymore, but it's important to our oil companies to do that because of what it does to the international price. What if we just got off of oil? And so what would happen? If you did add all those costs of oil, yeah, gasoline price at the pump would go up to $12.50. What would happen? We'd all be driving electric cars because the market would be sending us appropriate signals. And that's what you want. You want, if markets are going to work, if you give somebody a subsidy, it distorts the marketplace and people don't get the appropriate signals and they act irrationally. And if you want to maximize wealth for a nation, you have true free markets with no subsidies and no externalities, and that's what we ought to be making the American ideal, and we ought to be spending that money not on wars in the Gulf, but on building schools for our children and police and hospitals and making this the best country in the world, and not sending all of our money and our treasure over there and then bringing home our young boys in caskets. That's part of the cost of oil.
And so, Alex, on that point, it's a powerful argument that people hear, and we do have significant financial interests over there, and there are conflicts in that region, obviously, and have been for quite some time. There has been a pretty big boom here at home when it comes to natural gas, for example. It's not a political point. It's just a statement of fact, right? So is there a happy coming together that's possible based on the argument he's making against foreign intervention and the costs therein, negative externalities, and what we're doing here at home?
Yeah, I mean, I thought for a second he was going to say, "Oh, well, yeah, let's liberate domestic oil production."
Yes.
So,
if it can compete, I'm all for it.
Yeah, so there's so many things I want to talk about. I want to talk about let's talk about let me just say something about how how policy should work. So, because I have a very different view of how to do it. And I think the externalities way of basically the externalities way of doing it is that Robert or whomever Robert designates can arbitrarily say, yeah, I think, first of all, this idea there are no positive externalities except for profits, that's just nonsense. I don't know where that came from, but there's so many things to say. So just to take a positive externality, what's the positive externality of low cost, reliable energy in the 1970s and 80s, mostly from coal, making possible the internet, which you gave a nice tribute to earlier. Nobody paid the coal companies to free up the time and to give the opportunity to create the internet, and yet the abundance of time and the availability of electricity, that led to amazing innovation. So one of the great things about low-cost, reliable energy is not just that it allows you to use machines more effectively directly, but it frees up an amazing amount of time to innovate. So much of the innovation that we have in the world is based on low-cost, reliable energy, and we owe a huge thank you to these alleged destroyers of the earth who freed up this amazing time and gave us these amazing lives to create something like the internet. Now, Robert's, I don't know if it's a friend, but ally, Amory Lovins, I should say again, in the 1970s was saying we can replace fossil fuels with nuclear. He was anti-nuclear as well. He said we should replace fossil fuels with renewables and efficiency. And he said and this is in Chapter 1 of Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, which you read last night, I appreciate. He said we need to restrict the use of electricity. And which is all these negative externalities. So you can see this viewpoint just allows you these complete fascist destructive controls where you can say, yeah, I'm going to say there are all these negative consequences and I'm going to do a study and I'm going to make a calculation and therefore I can jack up your gasoline price to $12 and reassure you that there's going to be some amazing alternative. But there is a question of how do you deal with things that he's classifying as externalities, things like real pollution. So situations where coal is actually polluting. And I think the way to do it is you need to define rights. You need to define property rights. And the key thing you need to do is you need to define in different areas thresholds of how much emissions of X is okay and how much isn't. And one key principle of this is you cannot assume that any amount of it is dangerous. And a lot of the kinds of studies Robert is mentioning and these statistics that he's throwing around, what they're doing is it's based on what's called linear no threshold response. What that means is that if some quantity of something is toxic, then any quantity of something is toxic. And in reality, no. Some quantity of everything is toxic, but there's always a benign level, and often there's what's called a hormetic level, which is a beneficial level. So I do believe that we need to set standards for things like pollution. And if CO2 was a provable huge problem that was actually killing a lot of people, then and we really had replacements for fossil fuels, then we should talk about, okay, how do we define something like a threshold? I just don't think we're there, but absolutely you don't want to have it so that like mini dictators get to say, oh, I'm going to jack up this price here for this externality. We need to define the rights in a rational, pro-human way. And I believe that right now there should be no limit on CO2 because CO2 is such a necessary byproduct of something that we need to do more of, namely produce low-cost, reliable energy with fossil fuels. Let me just take one thing on the foreign policy. The foreign policy, it is not fair to demonize the substance, to blame the substance on all policies that are related to the substance. Every time you're dealing with energy, there are going to be good and bad policies for relating to it. And guess what? If we build solar and wind the way we're doing, which is a lot by abusive Chinese labor with really dangerous mining practices of rare earth metals, where they're cornering the market in China, you think that's not going to be a foreign policy issue? Dependence on there's dependence on Saudi oil, which we can get rid of a lot through our own production. What about dependence on Chinese magnets? Nobody talks about that. But so there's this bias of we're only going to talk about the negatives of fossil fuels. We're going to call renewables clean, even though there's such dirtiness in the manufacturing process. We're going to ignore all the foreign policy challenges with that. So I think we need a rational foreign policy, and I have huge criticisms of the way our oil policy has been conducted, and I think there are much better ways. But I don't think it's rational to say, oh, well, we shouldn't be allowed to use oil because oil policy has been conducted irrationally, and therefore we should commit energy genocide.
Okay, so I want to make sure that we get time for audience questions. So last subject, and just I'll sort of cheat a little bit and do a twofer, point of privilege. One has to do is, I know you're chomping at the bit to talk about nuclear, so I'll sort of hand you the football on nuclear to respond to some of the points that Mr. Epstein's been making all night. I also just want to ask, because we're talking about foreign policy, and we're talking about our nation and other nations, what do you say to Americans who say, okay, I'm sort of on board for a lot of the points that you're making, but if we're going to do it and handcuff ourselves and possibly hurt our economy when these developing nations with billions of people aren't really going to play ball with no real skin in the game, aren't we sort of just whistling past the graveyard, not making a real dent in the problem because they're out emitting us anyway and we're hurting our economy? To what extent is American unilateralism needed leadership, and how much of it would be possibly hurting our economy without other countries playing keep up, if you will? And then go ahead with nuclear.
You're giving me two questions.
Yeah.
I hope you give me double the time.
I will. And then one response, and then
we
questions.
don't have to worry. The Chinese and the Indians don't want dirty energy. They know it's killing 400,000 people a year, pollution in Beijing. China, they don't want it anymore. China is much more aggressive about adding renewables than we are. China is very aggressive, the most aggressive for a nuke program in the world. They're adding more solar every year than their entire nuke fleet. So if you look at China, India, the United States, and Germany, the four biggest economies, last year, we reduced, the four of them together, 36 terawatts of power. And we added 39 terawatts of power. And as I said, India and China are doing their part. India just canceled 14 gigawatts of coal plants, a bigger fleet than the entire British fleet. They're doing their stuff. I'll talk about nuke. Nuke, and by the way, it makes us more competitive. The more that you get rid of fossil fuels, the better quality of life, more competitive, the more we're developing technologies that the rest of the world wants. Doesn't hurt us. The IMF says reducing fossil fuels is a net benefit to our economy of $1.3 trillion. It helps us. It's not a cost. There's transition costs, but it's not a cost. Nuke. I'm all for nuke. I'm a market guy. I'm all for nuke if they can make it economic and if they can make it safe. Right? And by the way, nuke did not get destroyed like Alex suggested because of environmentalists. It got destroyed because of Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island. That was their problem. Nuke, if it's economic, as I say, the Vogtle power plant in Georgia is supposed to be $12 billion a gigawatt. It's $1 billion to build a solar plant. And guess what? The costs now look like they're going to go up to $25 billion. That's not good. I gave you what the cost of nuke is. It's 5 to 7 times what solar is. Who would want to do that? We can burn energy. We can make energy out of, like I said, prime rib. Why would we do that? And is it safe? Here's the thing. It's not me who's saying it's unsafe. It's the insurance industry who's saying, you are so hideously dangerous, we are not going to insure you. That's why the nuclear industry had to go to Congress in a sleazy legislative maneuver in the middle of the night and pass the Price-Anderson Act, which says that if a nuclear power plant explodes or has an accident and your house is injured, they don't have to pay you for it. That's the deal they got. What kind of deal is that? What other industry has that deal? Go look at your homeowner's policy. Everyone in the country says, we do not insure you against losses from radiation from a nuclear power plant. Now, so you have the most expensive, nobody would build a nuclear power plant unless the government intervenes. And so you have the most expensive fuel, then you have to take the waste and store it for 30,000 years, which is 5 times the length of recorded human history. How is that a moral, how can you make a moral case? This is what polluters do. It's a way of passing the cost of our generation's prosperity onto the backs of our children. It's not moral. And to pass it to 1,000 generations of children, that's what he wants for the solution to his energy problem, is make the future generations pay for it. You can't sell that as a moral cost. Today, right now, we spend $100 million a year. Taxpayers paying to store nuclear radiation, waste radiation on site at all these power plants, and it's going to double and triple every year. Why should taxpayers have to pay that? Utilities should have to pay that. Alex does not believe in markets. He believes in the kind of energy that he's talking about. If you look at it, which is big hydro, carbon energy, and wind and nuke, what do they have in common? They all can be controlled by wealthy billionaires. And what I want, and if we do that, if we have an energy, the political system tends to reflect the economic system. And if we have an economic system that's controlled by a few people, we will lose our democracy too. And what I'm suggesting is, let's get an energy system that all of us can participate in, that democratizes it.
So last response before we get to audience questions, specifically on nuclear power, the issue of cost, the issue of safety.
Yeah, so I've sort of been consistently saying that what's happening with Robert, but it's not about Robert, it's about the way the culture, and particularly many of the thought leaders who, like I would call the environmental thought leaders, think or think improperly, is that they just consistently ignore or dismiss the amazing, unique benefits of fossil fuels, and they consistently exaggerate, really wildly exaggerate and distort side effects. And I think it's interesting to see this done in the case of nuclear, and we could have a whole discussion about nuclear, but I'll just give you, just take one thing in terms of the safety. If you want to measure how safe something is, one good way to do it is to measure, I think the best way is how many deaths occur per unit of energy produced. And guess what the safest form of energy ever created is? By far, nuclear. Now, you mentioned, so Chernobyl, that was, not even that many deaths by the standard of many other things, but Chernobyl was a Soviet thing controlled by a totalitarian government. In terms of the actual free world with any kind of civilized laws, the example he gave was 3 Mile Island, right? So 3 Mile Island, how many people died from radiation there? 0 people. Died from there. So what is going on? Why is it hard to insure nuclear? The reason why nuclear has difficulty and the reason why nuclear costs have dramatically increased in multiple decades, despite the fact that knowledge of how to do it has increased, you'd expect it to become more efficient, is because, as I said, it's been demonized and criminalized by the modern environmental movement. And part of that is that there's such hysteria and demonization around nuclear, where people are terrified of being sued for any kind of crazy thing related to nuclear. It's not that it's actually going to kill you, it's the least likely thing to kill you. He mentioned nuclear plant exploding. Nuclear plants can't explode. The radioactive material in them cannot explode physically. So, what's that? Yeah, no, that was not an explosion of the radioactive material. That was like an explosion of like a hydrogen thing there. Okay, well, so Fukushima is also interesting because Fukushima was also zero deaths. The only deaths that come from these things are deaths from hysterically moving people out of the area, which particularly hurts older people. So what I just want to stress is there's a lot more to say about nuclear, but I mean, the fact is that nuclear is actually providing low-cost, reliable electricity, certainly compared to what renewables have done in Germany, in France. And so if you actually believed in an existential threat from rising CO2 levels, you'd really place priority on nuclear. Now, what you're hearing tonight is just that, oh, well, solar and wind, even with everything I've said, even though they've had decades, even though they have this fundamental problem of the unreliable fuel, even though they always require the unreliable energy infrastructure plus the reliable energy infrastructure, even though they always increase the cost, essentially what he's saying is, I, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., contradict all of that. I've got this amazing market, which hasn't been defined at all, in which these unreliables that actually are the worst performing things are somehow going to be the best performing things. And so we need to implement that in some magical way. And I'm not going to be clear at all about what's prohibited and what's not. And Alex is against markets. And what I'm saying is, no, we need to be free to pursue all forms of energy. We need to clearly define rights based on actual science, not pseudoscience and distortions. And we need to stop this bias against fossil fuels, nuclear and hydro. He says, I like them because wealthy billionaires are involved in them. No, it's the exact opposite. People become wealthy billionaires involved in them because they're actually good technologies. Just like people become wealthy billionaires on the internet because it's valuable. Jeff Bezos becomes a wealthy billionaire because it's valuable, because he can deliver a low-cost, valuable product to a lot of people profitably. So that's what is not doable by right now these imaginary energy industries. I wish you and all of your investments the best of luck, but you need to compete on a real market with profits, not on some sort of not on a market, not on a non-market that prohibits us from using the most important form of energy in our lives.
Okay, so we're going to put a pin.
Let me just say this, that the insurance industry, AIG, Swiss Re, Munich Re are the ultimate arbiters of risk in our society. They're not stupid people. They're not running away from an investment if they can make money. And, you know, for you to say they don't know what they're talking about and you know more about the risk from nuclear power plants than them is we're departing from fact-based reality. You know, you're saying the meteorology, you know more than the meteorologists, more than the pulmonologists, more than the climatologists, more than the toxicologists, you know, more than the insurance industry. And it's just, at some point, we have to wonder whether we can trust that, you know, that judgment.
Okay, so I think
I know that the environmentalists have made nuclear, have allowed all kinds of crazy lawsuits for nuclear that insurance companies wouldn't want to insure. That's why I say stop demonizing
Do you
and
think
decriminalizing.
morally that we should be able to impose on our generations of children to take care of
Oh yeah, I forgot to address that distortion. First of all, there are technologies for
Is that a
dealing with
moral?
that.
Can you make a moral case for
I
that?
did so well.
No, you need to. Yes,
Until the very end.
Yes, because if you can make it, you can make it safe. You can actually transform it into energy. I don't know why you're assuming that we have to leave it in the most precarious form.
Because nobody's figured out
forever.
how to do anything else with it, Alex.
They have, and nobody is dying from that waste, but people are dying for lack of low-cost, reliable energy
That's not
that
true.
you and your friends are prohibiting.
So we will stipulate profound disagreements for the moment, and I'd like to welcome to the stage. My time here, blessedly, is now over, and I will turn it over to a member of the faculty here at CU. His name is Matt Burgess. He specializes in environmental studies and economics, and he's going to be moderating the Q&A from the audience. My only contribution to this part is to say a brief reminder that for our purposes, especially with how long we have left, 10, 15 minutes, a question is 1 to 2 sentences with a question mark at the end of it, please.
So, are we going to line up with mics? Is that
The microphone right
so we
in the middle.
With mics. Heidi said we have 20 minutes, regardless if we go over a little bit over. And I just want to say a couple things. One is that I think regardless of what we think about this issue, I think we can all agree that polarization is really hurting our ability to solve big problems. And so I think it's great and really important that we have these kinds of conversations.
I agree.
And then secondly, while there are definitely big problems across the country and across the English-speaking world, in fact, in college campuses, I just want to point out that CU is a leader in a positive direction. Where are the protest mobs? I don't see any. I also don't see any metal detectors. And I want to acknowledge our regents and some of our other campus leaders for enshrining some of those values. We have protections for free speech and academic freedom and non-discrimination on political grounds. So use that freedom. Freedom is useless if you don't act free. So go forth and use that in your questions.
Showtime? Okay, there we go. So Alex, you said something about rare earth minerals that I really want to follow up on. And I've heard a lot about the environmental damages and danger to mining rare earth minerals, specifically cobalt. And I don't think it's something we really talk about enough, and how those minerals are used in the renewable technology. And that in the United States, we could mine them, but they would violate our EPA laws, so we can't. So then we purchase them from other countries. And as a young generation, as a millennial, that really bothers me that we don't look at that side of the coin, that we just ignore that. So I'd like to understand why. Why is this not something that we're saying when solar panels are so great, why don't we talk about this?
Thank you for the question, and I think you stated a lot of true facts in the question, so I don't have anything to argue with in the facts that you mentioned. The question of why is, so I'd put it on two levels. One is that there's this I mentioned this clear tendency to ignore the benefits of fossil fuels and exaggerate and distort the side effects. Related to that is there's this tendency to understate the side effects of certain forms of energy, namely solar and wind, and to ignore the downsides. And so, and to exaggerate the benefits. I think what's going on is, we could ask, why is there such an obsession with renewable, but not just renewable, but solar and wind? Why aren't we just focused on what's really the best energy? And I believe that it's because we have this idea that we shouldn't be impacting the planet. And people think, although incorrectly as your question implies, that solar and wind are somehow perfectly natural and in harmony with nature. And therefore it has this idea of, yeah, we're not gonna really disturb the planet, we're just gonna take the sun in. And as you're indicating, that is total nonsense, because you need a whole process to convert energy, and including to make the unreliable reliable. And so it's this massive process, and there are all these ignored practices. Now, this doesn't mean, I don't think that solar and wind should be prohibited. I just think that we should have rights protecting policies with the different practices for rare earths. I mean, but rare earths do have a lot of dangers with them, but I think that you can have good laws about them. But I would really encourage people to reject this idea that we should be choosing things based on how natural they are. We should be choosing things based on how beneficial to human beings they are. And that's why I choose things. Not whether billionaires are involved, but how good things are on balance for human beings.
Mr. Kennedy.
Hi. So I want to thank you guys both for coming. I guess it struck me throughout the discussion that kind of a core disagreement both of you have is how easy it will be to actually make the transition to renewable fuels. It strikes me there's a policy you guys could potentially agree on. If you put a price directly on carbon, not a cap and trade system, not regulations, but said we're going to have a price on it and rebate the money. If you're right, Alex, then you would not see much emissions reductions, and you would get mild wealth redistribution, and society would go on flourishing. And if you're right, Robert, then we would reduce emissions very, very quickly. Is that, am I wrong here? Is that something that you guys both couldn't support? A price on carbon that rebates the money is an effective bet to see who's right about just how hard it is to transition off.
Let's start with Mr. Kennedy this time.
Sorry.
I'm for it.
Mr. Epstein?
I mean,
There's a lot of different structures for, for doing carbon pricing, and they're all interesting. But what I think is that we should have markets, that if people are going to dump something into the common space, the commons, they ought to pay the cost of that. And Alex says there is no cost. The Arctic's not melting, the sea level's not rising, the glaciers aren't melting on every continent, the oceans aren't acidifying, and so that's, to me, that's the problem. If we could agree on kind of the facts, there's no mercury in our, in our fish, et cetera, then I think we can agree on a pricing mechanism. But there's lots of attractive pricing mechanisms. or imposing market discipline on the discharge of pollutants.
Mr. Epstein?
Okay, well, you can solve that problem by recognizing what I actually said, which is that I do believe those things happen. They're just being wildly exaggerated, and they're much smaller than the benefits we're getting. And also, I said I did not say you can just dump anything anywhere. I said we need to define rights based on actual science and what's actually going to benefit human beings. So no, I mean, what's going to happen is, what you do with these taxes is you're making energy. The way it works is usually that you're making the idea is usually you rebate it. It's usually you rebate it to consumers, right? So what's happening is, and people think, they call it revenue neutral. Revenue neutral, rather. I'm sorry. So it's called revenue neutral, and people think, this is really good. And revenue neutral must be neutral, but revenue neutral just means from the perspective of the government. The government isn't going to take it and spend it on something else. It's going to be given to you. But the issue is not what's happening with the government. It's what's happening with individual productive decisions, because the whole purpose of the tax is for less money to go into the lowest cost energy production, and that's going to make things more expensive everywhere. And this is what happened. I mean, we have a lot of case studies. Like in Australia, they passed a carbon tax. It drove up their electricity prices by 20%, and they rebelled against it because it was increasing their cost of living. So the last thing you want to do is do anything to make energy more expensive, because the higher cost energy is, the higher cost everything is. I want to make one other note about, and this relates to Guy's question about should we unilaterally do things as the US? What I'm really scared about in the world is not a global radical restriction of fossil fuels, because many countries are way too smart to do this. In this kind of renewables delusion that we've heard tonight, one thing is that China is somehow really pro-renewables. They built 60 coal plants in 2018 in China and commissioned 90 around the world. So they're really, really pro-coal. They seem to have not discovered the magic of ultra-cheap renewables. And so what's going to happen, and what does happen if we make our energy more expensive, we just make other companies who have truly lower cost energy more competitive, and we outsource our emissions, and we also outsource it to companies with more emissions in general. So no. I think that whether you define a law like that, the only reason would be you'd have to be really confident that there's a real disaster that we can actually do something about with the law. And if there was a real disaster, you'd have to do something globally, not make a senseless unilateral sacrifice that wouldn't actually do anything globally.
Okay, let's move on to another
New Deal.
question. That's okay.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to thank you guys for coming out. It was really great to hear all your ideas. I have a question for kind of both of you, but first Robert. So I actually appreciate your praise for the free market and your distaste for subsidies and everything. But if solar and wind are actually better and cheaper than the forms of fossil fuels that you were talking about, why do you need to ban fossil fuels in order to beat them in the market, since you're such a proponent of the free market?
Why do you need to ban them?
Yeah, why do you need to ban them?
I've said from the beginning, I'm not for banning them.
You support the Green New Deal, though.
Oh,
Yeah.
I didn't say that.
But you did. In reality, you did it.
So-
not on this stage.
I'm gonna take moderator's privilege here.
Let me
He
make
didn't-
it clear
he
then.
didn't,
Let me make it clear. I
those
don't
parts of it.
support a ban on fossil fuels. What I support are market mechanisms. And to the extent that that's part of the Green New Deal, I don't support that part of it.
I'll try to be as quick as I can. My question's more for Robert. Robert, in the wake of the Greta Thunberg spectacle, it became something of a joke in my Twitter circles and friend circles.
Greta Thunberg.
Sorry, I'm
the young
trying to
woman.
speak fast. That lefty journalists and people trying to prescribe everyday solutions for people were basically prescribing three main things: being eat bugs, have less kids, and eat less meat. And at the end of the day, if that's what it takes to kind of be an environmentalist, I'm fundamentally unwilling to play ball. Because at the end of the day, if Mr. Epstein is a bought and paid for Koch brothers shill and all the things you would suggest he is, I'll side with him first on the matter of human dignity, because I don't want to sell my family out first.
So what was the question?
So I guess the question would be about, we do hear from some environmentalists, it's morally wrong to have kids or too many kids. That's a tough sell.
I have nothing but admiration for Greta, but what is she, 12 years old?
16.
What? She's 16. So, She's trying to do something idealistic. She has a legitimate worry about the state of the globe. And I admire her for that. Would I go to her and say, let's say if I were president, would I appoint her the Secretary of Energy? No. I wouldn't, because I don't think a 16-year-old girl has that level of sophistication. And when I was 16, I saw things that were wrong. I felt an urgency to change them, and that's what she's trying to do. But I don't think that you should make up your mind about what environmentalists stand for and what they don't by listening to somebody who is that age. I laid out a platform tonight that I think is a rational, pragmatic platform that that supports American values, that supports free market capitalism, that rationalizes our marketplace so that a market does what it's supposed to do, which is to reward good behavior and punish bad behavior. I believe in free market capitalism because I believe that the marketplace promotes efficiency. Efficiency means the elimination of waste. Pollution is waste. A free market would urge us to properly value our natural resources, and it's the undervaluation of those resources that causes us to use them wastefully. In a true free market, you can't make yourself rich without making your neighbors rich and without enriching your community. What polluters do is they make themselves rich by making everybody else poor. They raise standards of living for themselves by lowering quality of life for everybody else, and they do that by escaping the discipline of the free market and forcing the public to pay their production costs. You show me a polluter, I'll show you a fat cat using political clout to escape the discipline of the free market and force the public to pay his costs.
Thank you. Let's move on to another question.
Let's
Move on to another question. Thank you.
I can't give you advice on that.
Hi. I have a brief question for each of you. Mr. Kennedy, what are your criticisms of hydro? And Mr. Epstein, is there any place for government-funded research into nuclear power?
Let's start with Mr. Epstein.
What are your criticisms of hydroelectric power?
Well, I don't like big hydro. I like, there's a lot of little hydro and in-river hydro that's very interesting now and that I would support. I've supported a couple of projects in Chile, but I think big hydro is a boondoggle, that it's not cost effective in many cases, and that over time, the reason dams are coming down now is not because environmentalists suddenly got powerful, it's that the dams don't work anymore. They fill up with silt, they destroy the rivers, they destroy other values. So I would say I wouldn't outlaw hydro. If I could find another way to make energy that was cheap and reliable, I would do it. And solar and wind are cheap and reliable.
Mr. Epstein?
Okay, I'll answer your question in 5 seconds so I can address what he said. So no, what needs to happen with nuclear is I mentioned stop demonizing and criminalizing. Like, you need a new infrastructure, not a new infrastructure, rather, you need a set of laws that hold nuclear to objective safety standards compared to everything else. Right now, there's just this prejudice where nuclear, even though it's the safest, has to do the most. And so if you impose enough safety regulations on things, then it just becomes impossible to afford. It's just like if you said, well, to be safe, Alex, you have to go around with 5 bodyguards all the time. Yeah, then I couldn't afford to live. That wouldn't actually help my life. And that's basically what we have with nuclear. I want to make a response to just this idea of, does Robert support the Green New Deal and this market thing? Like, you haven't said anything really specific about this, what this would be. You've promised a lot of things in terms of these technologies that fail would somehow succeed. But I remember at the outset you talked about net metering. So that's the most concrete thing I've heard. And so let's talk about net metering for 1 second. So net metering basically means you're saying, I'm generating unreliable energy from my home and I want to be paid. In practice, what net metering means is you get paid over twice the wholesale price. So basically you get paid twice as much for energy that is unreliable. wow, I wonder why people don't like that and resist that. Yeah, they don't want to overpay a bunch of so-called energy generators.
That's not what I said.
No, you
I don't
said
think that
negative
you
net.
should pay.
Well, that's what net metering laws do.
Market price.
No, but they want to be paid the retail price, not the wholesale
Who
price.
are you talking about?
Every advocate of net
Okay, I think we
metering-
should move on.
Well,
We should
you're not
let's
talking
take
about
2 more
me.
questions.
Okay, well, yeah.
That's another debating trick, putting words in my mouth and then
I'm having
arguing
to support
against
the
yourself.
Let's move on to another
the
question.
policies
Thanks.
that you're actually supporting in
Thanks,
reality
everyone.
that will be passed.
Next question.
Hi, I just wanted to thank both of you for coming out, and I just appreciate civilized discussion. But I just wanted to ask a question about a comment you made earlier, Alex. So I heard you say that there used to be levels of CO2 10 times as high as they are today, but the organisms back then were completely different, entirely different, adapted and evolved for 10 times higher CO2. So if as CO2 is rising as it is today, organisms, us, what we have today, if we have to adjust to that overnight, I think that'd be a lot different. Wouldn't it be cheaper to try to adjust for that now and prepare for that now through innovation in renewable resources rather than just like patching that up with a temporary solution through, say, fossil fuels?
Mr. Epstein?
So just to take the incorrect factual assumption, many of our plants are actually were developed in eras with much more CO2 than we have today. So I mean, in general, what has happened with more CO2 is a lot more global greening, which has been a huge net benefit, which is another case where the benefits of fossil fuels are being ignored, and again, the side effects are being wildly exaggerated and distorted. And your whole question is, well, shouldn't we do this with innovation and renewables? Well, first of all, forget renewable as a concept. I don't care whether it's renewable or natural or whatever. I want it to be good. So yes, we should support innovation, but that means freedom, including stop the criminalization of nuclear, as I keep referring to. But if you're talking about, oh, shouldn't we just do this and get rid of fossil fuels? No, because that means getting rid of the quality of life of billions of human beings, which has been my whole point tonight. This is an unbelievable value in our lives that we don't realize how good it is, and we don't realize that what we're taking for granted is the most amazing life anyone has ever had, and it's because there's this one industry that's figured out how to produce low-cost, reliable energy for all of our different needs for billions of people. That is an unbelievable achievement. We should welcome others approximating that achievement, but nobody has come close, and if we want our standard of living and billions more want it, we need to leave the fossil fuel industry free to produce energy, and we need to be free to willingly buy it.
Mr. Kennedy, do you want 30 seconds to respond, and then we'll take one last question?
No, I would just point out another thing, which is that last week the Ohio State Legislature, which are essentially indentured servants for the incumbents, the energy incumbents, voted to bail out the utility in Ohio to the tune of $1 billion because of cost overruns at their nuclear power plant. Oh, I mean, does anybody, I don't even understand where, this is socialism for the rich. It's socialism for, these incumbents. And it's a very cushy socialism for them and a ruthless, merciless capitalism for everybody else.
Okay, we'll take one last question. I'm being told one more, so let's.
So my question is for you. I understand that you believe that fossil fuels might not end the world like tomorrow, but empirically, fossil fuels are going to stop being sustainable at some point in time. So why would we not start transitioning now if we can? And realistically, isn't it truly moral to prioritize our future today instead of just waiting until climate change eventually does become that apocalyptic scenario that you're talking about?
Okay,
Mr. Epstein?
Yeah, so there's kind of these two apocalypses, these two contradictory apocalypses. One is we're not going to have enough fossil fuels, and the other is we're going to have not enough, and we're going to run out, or we're going to have too much, and it's going to cause a catastrophe. And so I think we need to look at with having not enough. People are constantly, if there's freedom, they're constantly searching out better ways to produce energy. Now, often the best way to produce energy is more fossil fuels, but the fact that we use fossil fuels now or in 10 years doesn't mean that people aren't looking for better alternatives. They are all the time, and that's why I'm so emphatic about being free to pursue all alternatives. instead of this religiously restricted, oh, let's just do renewables or small renewables or unreliable renewables. In terms of climate, that's just a total assumption that that's going to be an apocalypse, that we've changed the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere from 0.03% to 0.04%, then we might change it to 0.05%, and that's going to be a disaster. The assumption here is that significant human impacts on nature are inevitably self-destructive, whereas the reality is that sometimes our impacts can be destructive, but overwhelmingly what we need to do is massively impact the Earth to have a good life for human beings. Before humans massively impacted the Earth, life was terrible. Like, you could be rich only if you exploited other people. Robert mentioned slavery at the beginning. Why did slavery end? Well, one big reason is we harnessed low-cost, reliable energy from fossil fuels, so people stopped trying to harness energy from humans. So in terms of our future, we can have an amazing future. If we're free to use all forms of energy, we can keep having huge benefits from fossil fuels. We can keep having very manageable side effects. We can find better things. And life can get better and better for more people, just as it's gotten better and better for billions of people in the last 40 years. So 40 years ago, people were saying, let's stop using fossil fuels. And if that had happened, billions of people today would have shorter life expectancies. What I'm saying is those same calls now are being said for now. What I'm saying is we're free to use fossil fuels and other forms of energy. Life can continue to get better for billions of people. And if we radically restrict it, then life is going to get worse for billions of people.
Mr. Kennedy, do you want a quick response?
Yeah, I mean, Alec mentioned, the end of slavery, because a more efficient form of energy came along. And it set me to remembering that when I was in college, I took a course which was a course about the moral justifications for slavery. And it was the same kind of justifications you hear for fossil fuels today, that it came from the Greeks, it came from the Egyptians, that slavery allowed leisure time, allowed us to create art, and then it came from preachers in the South, and there were a lot of sermons that we had to read about people who were quoting the Bible to justify slavery, so to do it. The reason slavery ended in this country was not because a more efficient fuel came along or because it was immoral. It's because we beat them in a war. And that energy source was willing, in order to hang on to their profits and their old, immoral, discredited form of producing energy, they were willing to destroy this country. They were willing to kill 669,000 Americans. And that's what happened. It was a very, very difficult transition. And the economic stake of fossil fuel industry in this antiquated model is at least as great as the slave owners had in the South. So yeah, there's going to be a struggle to transition. We're going to transition because we're more efficient. We can produce energy cheaper than they can. And we're doing it today. It's cheaper, it's more reliable, and that is why it's going to change.
Thanks, everyone. I have
a yes or no question.
I think I've been told that we have one, that was the last question, so I'm just going to thank all our debaters and welcome Madison Meeks to the stage.
So many of us at the university level have come to find that the university truly is a bubble. So I want to thank all of our speakers for coming here and popping a little bit of our Boulder bubble. I also want to thank our student leaders from Free to Be for helping our event move so slowly, or so swiftly. And I want to thank all of you for being here because you guys truly are the push for intellectual diversity at our university level.